thank you very much, first of all, for this invitation. General Ibrahim Attahiru would be immensely pleased and appreciative if he could become aware of another passing being commemorated today, indeed this very moment. The connection is that the late Prince Tony Uranta, whose week-long remembrance rites have already commenced in Lagos and Opobo, shared an article of faith with the late general, namely that the sustainable security of society is crucially dependent on a tripod whose three legs are the people, the army, and the government. Thus, the weakness or flaws in any one leg leads to the collapse of society. The mandatory implications of this, in practical terms, are that each must come to the aid of others to compensate for weaknesses, but also to enthrone mutual understanding and collaboration. Tony Uranta actualized this credo by forming a troop support initiative in 2019 under the name, the hashtag #WeCare. I did not hesitate to serve on the board. Regrettably, owing to my notoriously charged existence, my membership has been more symbolic than active. Why do I regret this? And why did I readily welcome any opportunity to make up for this deficiency? Well, to begin with, I happen to have been raised in a family with some military connections that goes all the way back to World War II. Those of you who browsed through my childhood biography will recall the story of my first encounter with a serving member of the then West African Frontier Force. Then on leave he was from all freshly discharged from the war theater and he visited us in Ake Parsonage. And my sister and I engaged in unequal combat with this man, his uncle or cousin, when he visited our home in Ake Parsonage, Abeokuta. Our parents were absent at that time, and this stranger, as he was there in uniform, conducted himself in a less than decorous manner, so we fought him. In retrospect, I find it one of the most hilarious episodes of my childhood, and I sometimes suspect that it laid the foundation for the total demystification of the military that is part of my makeup. But also, it induced a lasting empathy with the humanity of the serving man. That family connection has been sustained. At the inception of the Boko Haram insurgency, a close family member served at the war front, where he and his soldiers took the brunt of the earliest onslaught from that product of religious lunacy. I received first-hand accounts of the challenging technicalities of engaging with an unpredictable foe whose most lethal weapon was fanaticism, increasingly augmented, however, by sophisticated hardware that my cousin's own forces sorely lacked. Such an anomalous series of confrontations, accompanied by the irony that his superiors demanded a rapid and definitive victory over the enemy, are thus not new and remain depressing. Indeed, this high-ranking officer would eventually find himself under court-martial on a charge of cowardice in the face of the enemy, and he was duly convicted. He appealed, and, backed by corroborated evidence, was vindicated. His dismissal was reversed, but his punitive demotion was not. Such cases are not new or rare. The case files of that feisty lawyer and human rights advocate, Femi Falana, are filled with instances of such miscarriages of justice, and which are sometimes rectified. Often, however, they are not. They are subsumed under the formula of esprit de corps, a fear of inserting a disruptive note in a system based on unquestionable obedience to orders. Some of us are constantly exposed, far more than generally realized, to the grisly details of these internal contradictions in the disciplined services. And that includes engagements on the international field, such as UN keeping forces, and closer home, ECOMOG. One's empathy with the fighting man thus goes beyond even the self-exposure to the ultimate sacrifice on the battlefront. Even when we're powerless to ameliorate their condition, as the third supposed leg of this uneven, precariously balanced tripod, we identify with their frustrations, their sacrifices, and honor their memory. Along their career, we also develop lasting friendships. I never did meet General Attahiru, but thanks to his wife's, his widow's dedication, I believe I do know him. That's not difficult for someone of my temperament, and whose occupation requires probing beneath skin and flesh, and even beyond bone into marrow, to discern reality and truth from mere hype. One instinctively reconstitutes the truthful persona from a uniformity of attributes offered from colleagues within his profession, but also from without, those whose paths happen to have intersected with his. It also helps that one of the spurs to my acceptance to be here today was a senior colleague of his in the same unit, in the same department, Air Force, who had preceded him hence. I refer to the late Ibrahim Alpha, with whom I was especially close. Those of you who read my memoirs, You Must Set Forth at Dawn, will surely recollect my account of the circumstances that brought Ibrahim and me together and resulted in a remarkable bonding. That friendship did not go unnoticed, since it led to the late dictator Sani Abacha imposing on Ibrahim a special assignment. He was to track down this very speaker, a plane always at his disposal at short notice, in order to convey overtures of peace talks during a desperate phase in that dictator's misbegotten venture into power. I no longer recall how much detail of that episode I recounted, and You Must Set Forth at Dawn, but I do testify that Ibrahim Alpha did catch up with me eventually in London, carried out his diplomatic mission in all seriousness, but with the aplomb and finesse of one endowed with a deep sense of humor, after which, having received the very answer that he expected, we both retired to the nearest wine bar in Bayswater. Perhaps the only difference in an imagined encounter with Attahiru in place of Alpha would have been that Attahiru would have sipped water or orange juice in place of wine. And now, a confession. Buffeted from every sensory direction by the absolute conviction that there does exist a basic inner code of self-regulation, what we might call the lowest common denominator that governs all who consider themselves members of the human family, it is unavoidable that I devote the rest of this contribution to a series of apologies. The first goes to the convener of this very event, the widow, Madame Fatih Attahiru. That apology, and to all the widows as well, and even to the entire family. And that apology is deserved by my momentary decision, not even once, but twice, to cancel my appearance here today, despite a firm commitment. The explanation for such a negative impulse has to do with my oft-stated view that certain kinds of assault on human sensibility in this nation should attract nothing less than a total shutdown in whatever affected state until that untoward event is resolved. That consideration has a long history. It became galvanized, not surprisingly, by an unprecedented human desecration, an event that inserted the word Chibok into global awareness in the tragic mode, to be followed by Dapchi, then evolved into the haphazard venture with schools as primary targets. It did not end there, as that new culture in child degradation, commonly referred to as kidnapping, became rampant. I seized whatever opportunity I had to reiterate that position, namely, that whenever any member of our community goes missing, only to resurface as the voice of an invisible surrogate negotiating his or her sale like any other market commodity, such a state should simply shut down totally, leaving only security agencies at large to restore to us our collective dignity. My spate of apologies, as you must have anticipated by now, extends further back in time. They instigate memory all the way back to my response to the family, clan, village, and state of that innocent man, Akaluka, whose severed head was stuck on a pole, behind which his murderers sang, danced, jubilated, and extolled the might and peace of Allah, against whom it was alleged the victim had committed the unpardonable crime of blasphemy. Akaluka was hunted down, dragged out of a police station where he had taken refuge, dehumanized and butchered. Now, does that scenario ring painfully familiar and immediate? My apologies leap over numerous unremarked, unrecorded mimics, simply reduced to statistics in the nation's subconscious, to plead for acceptance by the family also of Madame Oluwatosin, a school teacher posted to Bauchi in a routine educational process as the invigilator. She was similarly hunted down like wild prairie, stripped naked, dragged to her messy death. It culminated in a funeral pyre of motor tires. She was accused, like Akaluka, of having disrespected a factory-lined copy of a book known as the Holy Quran. Again, is that real from history? Spin once again on familiar groups? And just to add piquancy to this feast of the macabre, the torturers, the killers in that preceding instance were also school pupils and of a model secondary institution. She was also dragged out from sanctuary, the headmaster's home or office, which she had fled for protection. For those who dispute that history, this reason that history merely repeats itself, the young Deborah is merely a tragic disputant. Tawdry, dismal, inglorious history. Never mind the sight of jubilating mobs fouling the air with chants of victory and parading the spoils of war. But why do I burden myself with this Jeremiah of apologies? Simply for the reason I've just stated. It would have been, at its most profound, a dereliction of duty. And our event today is to commemorate that communal imperative that sustains faith in our collective being. No one will deny we all owe a duty to the living. But some incline to the stance that such duty terminates only with the living. Well, in my school of reflection and the testimony of history, that duty extends to death and beyond. That claim is grounded not in mere sentiment, not in attachment to morbidity or unassuaged grief, but in banal self-interest. For instance, if having failed to save Akaluka, having failed to rescue Uluwatosin, setting aside the hundreds, probably thousands of other victims, if we had openly, justly, and rigorously ensured justice in the crime that terminated their existences, we would not now be apologizing to the latest victim of such religion-inspired barbarity. I refer, of course, to Ms. Deborah Samuel. Of course, we're not all to be found within the same terrain of sensibilities. Absolutely not. And that has been demonstrated most vividly by the very nature of responses that have been exacted after the nation's recent exercise in human sacrifice. The nation's president, traditional rulers, among them the Sultan of Sokoto, who also serves as the Emir of Nigerian Muslims, women organizations, workers, unions, and professionals from all walks of life, young and old, have raised their voices in accents of apology and condemnation. However, a glorified cleric, no less than the Grand Vizier of the iconic mosque of this nation's capital, Abuja, has inserted a dissenting voice. The young woman, Deborah, he declared, deserved her death. This mullah, allegedly a man of learning, since his name is professionally captioned with a professorship, said that there is a line, a red line, that none of us must cross, no matter who we are, what we think, professor value. Like the late Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, this mere mortal has declared himself the supreme being with the power of life and death over all the denizens of the world. His call is unambiguous. Professor Ibrahim Bakari has placed his myrmidons of faith on the alert, trying to emulate the example of these death-dealing mutants of fanatic indoctrination. Permit me to digress. This digression is one, however, that is pertinent to this occasion. I must take you back to December 2015. On that day, and not for the first time in the career of a certain religious sect, hundreds of lives were mown down in broad daylight, and within minutes in the state of Kaduna. The presumed leaders of the alleged provocation were locked up, charged with every kind of criminal conduct, and are still battling, even till today, for their full liberation. Now, what exactly was their crime? They also had drawn a line. That line, they declared, should not be crossed by any. Well, it seemed that they had made their match. The army also had a line, but the shared leaders apparently did not know where it was drawn. For that, they paid a deadly forfeit of numerous lives. So there we are. Solitary lines crisscrossing, drawn by individuals and constituencies of beliefs and non-beliefs, of power and aspiration of power. Nowhere do the belligerents profess the common constitutional line and the boundaries of legitimate conduct that supposedly define the imperatives of cohabitation and respect for human commonality known as life. In the ongoing war in the Ukraine, it has been demonstrated that an ancient line remains forever with us, and that those who deliberately kill defenseless civilians are regarded as criminals, war criminals, to be placed on trial at the first opportunity. A Russian soldier at this very moment is undergoing that line of instruction. He has not only pleaded guilty, but actually confronted the widow with the words, "I am sorry." Professor Imam Ibrahim Makari, however, insists with a handful of others, including a vocal serving policeman quite recently, that there is no remorse involved in the torture and lynching of a young student on this earth, which we all share. To anyone who cares to listen, Makari has implicitly directed his followers to take the law into their own hands in the name of religion and in a nation beset on all sides by wars of altered nationalism and religious fanaticism. That is the message of a supposedly holy man to youths, to us, his message to a nation embroiled in a madness of multiple insurgencies. Yes, thank you very much. I'm nearly finished. I have also drawn my own line. I drew it decades ago, and it's contained in numerous statements, among them, most prominently, the unappeasable price of appeasement. I direct all who are interested to find some of those essays and be instructed by them.